Hello, friends, fellow deviants. This is Topography, the podcast exploring the contours of design spaces, be they physical, social, digital, or purely imagined. I'm Ashley Hoden. Today's talk is with Matthew Gandy. He is a geographer, urban field ecologist, and award-winning documentary filmmaker. He is professor of geography and fellow of King's College at the University of Cambridge. He previously taught at the University of Sussex and University College London, where he was the founder and director of the Urban Laboratory from 2005 to 2011. He was also a visiting scholar at Columbia University in New York, Humboldt University Berlin, Technical University in Berlin, University of the Arts Berlin, Newcastle University, the Rachel Carson Center Munich, Hamburg Institute for Advanced Study, and at UCLA. He has published a huge number of papers and written several books, most recently Natura Urbana, Ecological Constellations in Urban Space. He also wrote The Fabric of Space, Water, Modernity, and the Urban Imagination, which I read and loved and which forms the basis of much of our conversation today. He is also the writer and director of two films, Natura Urbana, The Break-In of Berlin, and Liquid City. Okay, Matthew Gandy, welcome to Topography. Thanks for agreeing to talk with me.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Yes, absolutely. So I've read some of your work. I just recently read Fabric of Space. And I came across your name through, came across your work through the article you did at LA Plus with the Glare of Modernity. And so I guess up front, just would be curious. What I've read is that you're a geographer focused on cultural, urban, and environmental aspects of geography, with a focus on landscape infrastructure and biodiversity.
Mm-hmm.
And so just up front, I guess I'd be curious about what that has entailed overall through the years, different aspects of what you've studied.
Sure. Geography's, in a way, it's a perfect discipline for me because it doesn't really restrict you to particular topics or methods. So that's been great for me. So I've studied geography all the way through, and it's really opened up all kinds of different possibilities for studying cities, urban nature, technological networks. So every avenue of my curiosity has been served very well by being a geographer, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of the things that I found really appealing was you seem to be very urban. You've explored urban spaces and their interplay with the natural world, and overlaying cultural aspects of historical work, filmmakers, writers, and it just opens up a richness of how you can kind of explore where we stand in the world and the environments that we create for humanity. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, on the question of the urban, I take quite a loose definition. I mean, the urban can be a city in a conventional sense, but the urban can also be global technological networks, extractive landscapes, infrastructure networks, of course. So it can be different things. And something that fascinates me is this question of, where does the boundary lie between urban and not urban? And some of these spaces are very intriguing to me. So when I've been doing research, for example, in Chennai in southern India, I was very interested in these landscapes to the north of Chennai, these incredible lake landscapes that are rapidly changing and transforming. So you have these juxtapositions between giant cement works and then pools full of beautiful lily flowers and very, very intriguing juxtapositions.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's I one of the things that I noted was the idea of a city versus sort of like urbanization. And
Yes.
so what kinds of transformations then were happening in Chennai to those spaces?
I mean, Chennai is a number of examples of rapidly growing cities in the global south, but it happened to be one of the cities that I included in my recent project, Rethinking Urban Nature. And in visiting and talking to people, I became especially interested in disappearing urban wetlands, and particularly migratory birds, which still arrive in vast numbers but in these kind of diminishing or degraded ecosystems. And that really got me thinking very hard about these rapidly transforming landscapes, but also thinking about urban ecology, if you like, beyond the kind of conventional lens of what we know has happened in Europe or North America, for example, trying to really think about how these concepts and ideas travel in very different localities and situations.
Yes, yeah. So in the Chennai context, the city's starting to push out into these wetlands, actual like
Yes, it's been
build.
happening exactly. It's been happening very rapidly, and then partly as a consequence of that and the loss of the natural floodplain, there have been some recent very dramatic flood events across the metropolitan region. In some
Mm.
cases, half of the city submerged underwater.
Oh,
Um,
whoa.
so this is really a major challenge, and I've been involved. I publish articles in scientific journals, and there were sort of mysterious holdups with journals because actually they subcontract a lot of their work to cities like Chennai, and nothing was happening because everything's underwater, but the companies wouldn't really divulge what the particular problem was they were facing. So these kind of very interesting kind of, if you like, real-time disruptions of academic publishing because of these ecological contradictions in relation to production processes and things of this kind.
Like there was like almost a, are you, I want to make sure I understand correctly. So like
Yes.
politically they were holding back the publication, or it was actually like an issue caused by the disturbance of daily life?
Well, in a way, both. I mean, you have because of these flood events, and many cities in the global south, of course, are much more on the front line from climate change. So you have a disruption caused by ecological, if you like, the ecological contradictions of rapid urbanization. But you also have complicated political discourses around so-called smart cities and patterns of investment, and actually when I looked more closely with some of my colleagues at the questions of flood risk, in some cases the degree of risk is actually deliberately concealed because it unsettles emerging land markets and things like that. So you have very complex topographies intersecting with these very complicated, so multifaceted processes of speculative urbanization. And the politics of it also, of course, relates to indigenous communities, original communities, fishing communities and so on, being pushed out of areas because of the inflating land values. So there's a lot. I mean, to bring it to a sort of a finer point in a way, there's a lot going on, and it's extremely interesting, I think, and important to be watching what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. That I would imagine in India too, that is um a very complex and um opaque. I don't know. It just seems like they're even just what I was reading in Fabric of Space in Mumbai, this idea like or the idea of how the space how it's governed and the reach of the bigger, let's say, national government, and then the interrelation of local government, um, business leaders, and who controls, like in that case, the delivery of water, but just in general, who governs the space. It seems like there's a lot of conflicting forces, and the national government doesn't necessarily have as much reach as we would maybe see in Europe or the US. And there's a lot of push and pull between a lot of different power centers, maybe.
Yes, sure. I mean, it's a very, very complicated scenario. I mean, from an academic perspective, because my earlier research was very, very much based in Europe and North America, I found it really valuable to look at urbanization processes, not just in India, but also Nigeria as well. And it kind of forced you to really think carefully about your assumptions, your conceptual categories, your analytical frameworks in a very productive way. So I've always been very drawn to uh, models, if you like, of urban research, which expand the intellectual frame geographically as well as conceptually. So my colleague Jenny Robinson, for example, her work on comparative urbanism has been very interesting to me in the sense of not a conventional comparison, but more a kind of stimulus to imaginative rethinking as an entry point. The other thing you mentioned very briefly about film and so on. One of the really interesting recent trends is the rise of the environmental humanities across many different fields, and sometimes I have to pause for a second and think, well, what is the environmental humanities? Why is that interesting? What is it doing that maybe hasn't been happening before? And I think, for me, in simple terms, I think it's widening the range of research entry points. So in order to understand, let's say, a rapidly growing city, instead of looking at census statistics or something, let's look at a novel or a film or even a piece of music as the kind of intellectual entry point. Because sometimes artists and writers are raising really important questions that are absent within conventional social science paradigms, for example. So that, for me at least, that's why I think the environmental humanities is bringing something very interesting to these questions.
Yeah, that was one of the things. Yeah, and reading your work was how much richness that brought to the dialogue, because it's capturing sort of how the more visionary artistic thinkers were portraying the world that they were living in at that moment. And then you can overlay that with, more of a, let's say, I don't know if it's the right way of saying it, but more, let's say, like a data driven, or like some of these other more conventional ways of viewing it. And you get a bigger picture because it's taking into account daily life. And
Sure, and then you get some novelists like the English novelist J.G. Ballard, who I've always found very interesting, and his particular take on the near future and exploring these sort of technological anomalies or aspects of modernity that are on the brink of some kind of failure or rupture in some way. So his great novel High Rise from 1975 about dysfunctional high-rise living is very prescient in terms of thinking through some of these kind of dystopian developments and breakdowns in the social structure within these new architectural complexes and things of that kind. So literature can be an endlessly fascinating entry point in terms of thinking about various aspects of urbanization, I think.
yeah, so going, like, it's taking that forward, what are, if we are to project forward, what do you see as some of these major issues? Like, whether it's, I don't know, AI is always one of the, but going forward from where we stand now, do you envision, do you have thoughts about how that could, where we're headed, I guess, and the perils?
Well, I mean, if you think of really, really high-profile science fiction writers like Gibson, in some of his recent interviews, it's really interesting because he was, in a way, he was a kind of an analog writer on a typewriter, busy thinking about the future, and he's made some really interesting comments and remarks. And then there are regional literatures. So in Argentina, Bazterrica, Exquisite Corpse is about a scenario where animals have become poisonous from a health perspective, which is interesting in itself.
Huh.
And therefore, in a very macabre way, protein has to be sourced differently. I won't give it away, but I think nevertheless, it's really interesting working through alternative scenarios and bringing together so many different strands.
Yeah, I could see that with, in relation to plastic. Um, it's becoming so just embedded in our environment, and the water we drink and the food, like, it's just permeating everything. And that's a really interesting idea about just animals becoming poison, and having to negotiate that world. And I don't know. I'm hearing too about the thing about plastic is it's even decreasing our fertility pretty dramatically. But um, yeah,
Yes, I mean, there's a whole range of evidence now about, I think they're called endocrine disruptors, I think is one of the technical terms, and there's a lot of research on this. So I think it is very helpful to think in terms of a triple crisis, essentially, so that you have a biodiversity crisis, a climate crisis, but also an emerging health crisis as well, of which the COVID-19 pandemic is a part. But all of these things are interrelated, and I think one of the biggest challenges now is to build an integrated perspective on what's really happening in terms of global environmental change.
yeah, I think that's a really good point. The integrative perspective and taking into consideration just every facet of I don't know, like the political side. How do the political systems are they able to work with these, to respond to these issues, and then technologically, and I mean, it's just every single aspect economically, like with let's say climate and environmental issues. Um, like I've seen just the economic use of sanctions being completely destructive environmentally of countries that have been placed on sanctions because they're in a position where they just the only thing they have are their natural resources then because they've been so shut off. And if you don't consider that aspect of the interplay between the economics and the environmental devastation and bringing climate to the climate crisis, there's sort of this tension between um, doing nothing or doing the wrong things. And you can see like in Sri Lanka where they just tried to go straight to organic fertilizers and just cut off the use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, and it's leading to total upheaval. And yeah, this comprehensive view it's so important. But
Absolutely. And I mean, also looking at individual examples, like in Ecuador, I was reading where they have had some of the most advanced approaches to trying to protect rainforests and things of that kind, rewriting the constitution. But as part of their debt crisis, they've recently been forced to effectively sell off mining rights to some of the most protected biodiversity reserves and so on. So it's it's a tangled web. It's very complicated. And even if you think a really innovative policy has been nailed down, how long can it last in the face of various kinds of economic or political turbulence? So we have to be looking at all of these things, I would say.
yeah, absolutely. Um, so I wanted to actually just ask like some fundamental questions,
Sure.
just as like a big picture idea. And so kind of going back to like a city versus urbanization,
Mm.
like what is a city? There's examples in the past where it's compared to like a body with different organs or a machine, and so I'm just curious your thoughts on exactly what is a city.
I mean, if you look at aspects of archaeology and what sometimes people refer to as deep history,
Hmm.
there's a case for early settlements that you could perhaps describe as urban settlements, but by contemporary standards, these are really villages or small towns. So the question of when does the urban really emerge is, I think, certainly later. But it's interesting also that if you like, the epicenter of urbanization and large cities has shifted over the centuries, so that at certain points, East Asia was very prominent, and then at a later time, parts of Europe and North America, and now again parts of South and East Asia, and so on. So the epicenter has shifted somewhat. I think it is important, like we were discussing earlier, to keep a handle on the distinction between a city as a kind of a nodal point and urbanization as a broader set of processes.
Hmm.
Equally, I think the sense that cities and modernity are very closely linked. I think also we need to be a little cautious on that, because there are some very sophisticated technological networks that predate what we understand modernity to be. So the city of Yazd in what's now northern Iran, with the wind catchers and other amazing technologies to cool buildings and things like that. The underground, very sophisticated underground water supply systems from mountains to desert cities and so on. So I think let's be careful about the longer term history. And it's sometimes, I think, quite helpful if we're thinking about modernity to maybe try to refine it just a little bit more, so that modernity tends to refer, I think, really to a greater self-awareness in social and historical terms, in the way that critics like Raymond Williams might have described it. And then perhaps you have modernization, which is more those specific technological networks associated with 19th century urbanization, the extension of railways, shipping routes, and things like that. And then, to be even more precise, perhaps in the 20th century, we have modernism as a cluster of very innovative developments in art, literature, architecture, and other fields.
Mm-hmm.
And then its counterpoint of postmodernism, which suddenly seems like a debate that is sort of in the past already now, although it was the big in the 90s. I can remember that it was the big thing and everybody was talking about postmodernism, but it's kind of faded somewhat.
I like to, I don't know if this is even relevant anymore or where it fits, but I don't know where, it may have been Frederick Jameson, The Cultural Logic of Late Capital. Is it where they equate sort of postmodernism as where the modernism emerges, there's still sort of like it sits side by side with places that have not modernized. And then postmodernism is kind of like where the modernization process is kind of just wiped out all pre-modern, and it's sort of the completion almost of modernism. So it's just taking the same ethos and forces to a more complete state. Does that tend to make sense?
Sure. I mean, my recollection of this debate as it took shape in the 90s is that the post-modernity, post-modernism debate was a multifaceted set of developments stretching across architecture to philosophy. But the kind of the main point of contestation, which in some ways is still relevant, I think, is between the body of ideas which tended to see postmodernism as a continuation or extension that could be understood within existing analytical or theoretical terms. And there was a critique here of some of the Marxist scholars like David Harvey, who in a sense did not really fundamentally adapt their theoretical position. And then there were a range of feminist and post-colonial scholars and others who said, wait a minute, postmodernism is actually about fundamentally changing how we understand and interpret human societies, as well as the concrete changes that Harvey and others have referred to. And maybe Jameson is a bit more of an intermediary figure here in terms of his cultural logic of late capitalism.
Yeah.
And now I'm coming across the term late modernity, Andreas Brackwitz and some of the German sociologists, so that I think there has been this sense of trying to apply different periodizations. But for various reasons, I think that recent change tends to be magnified in terms of its conceptual debate as a kind of recurring phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I could see that being the case. I really like the idea of the shift to modernity being an increase in self-awareness or self-identity. I don't know. Like I think of I had an experience in Myanmar where I was in a pretty remote, isolated village, and Myanmar itself is very isolated. So it's been somewhat culturally shielded from a lot of what's occurred almost everywhere in the globe. Whether you're rich or poor, all countries have been sort of exposed to a more, contemporary life. But Myanmar is somewhat held out just because of the government there. And I got the sense that in this village, and it probably carries to a number of other places, in at least in Myanmar. It was more about like the social context is more like if you're a good father or a good mother or an obedient son or daughter. It was kind of like more of your role in the village, as opposed was the primary consideration or the more important factor of how the people engaged with each other, as opposed to you yourself and how, like, are you being sort of like bringing what you bring to the table to a more complete way. It I don't and that was just me as an outsider seeing it, but I feel like there's something there about, like, how the shift from, let's say, the ancient regime, to, like, Braudel work to now, there is something about, like, identity and, bringing the self, and kind of it becomes a little bit more individualistic, but it also has a richness to it that is eh, maybe new historically.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting observation. I mean, I've just been actually looking at some work on eco-socialism and Marxist theory and metabolic rift. And one of the points raised by this Japanese theorist, Saito, is that an alternative to a capitalist society is one in which the ultimate product is a good person, that that's the whole emphasis on what you're trying to achieve. And that maybe that resonates a bit with what you're describing.
Yeah, yeah, because what was so interesting is that it's not like the people there are like they're so brilliant. I mean, I met this farmer he taught himself English to in order to stay current with the research farming technology, like of how to grow better watermelon. He fed me watermelon that he had, and it was because my motorbike broke down, and I just happened to break down right next to his stall. And of course, like all these, farmers know how to fix everything because they have to fix everything to keep going. But it was like a clear indication that there had been like a non-capitalist route to a contemporary life that you don't see almost anywhere else, because that place was so isolated and held away that they found different paths, and you could see almost like the non-capitalist path forward. That's really interesting. I didn't know about the his research. That's Yeah. And also one of the things there too is that was the example that where I could see the damage of sanctions. And I think maybe this ties in with the idea of urbanization, because their forests are gone, and they, despite being theoretically isolated from the market, all that teak ends up in yachts and furniture outside the country. And the people then, uh, oh, sorry, this is telling me oh, it's telling me the meeting's gonna end. Um, anyhow, I'm gonna try to keep this going, but they're left with whatever's left, to burn for food, for fire, and or for to cook with. And so it is sort of like the expansion of urban urbanization affecting these remote areas, and it's basically just like a resource frontier. And so essentially it still would be considered like an urban landscape in that
Yes.
way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. In terms of these extractive frontiers and so on. I mean, I think that one of the tensions I think within the environmental literature is the view that cities are in some way the cause of environmental degradation in some obscure conceptualization of agency, and then on the other hand, a sense that cities are kind of fulcrum of cultural and political experimentation and generating a variety of progressive ideas that might be relevant to trying to solve some of these wider global problems and issues. And I think I think there has been to some degree a shift in terms of how cities are being conceptualized. in environmental literature that could be very important.
As like sort of like the ideas hubs, like the
Yes, but
friction and
very much so.
interaction is.
Yes, and the way that a lot of cities are experimenting with a lot of different environmental approaches, and there are networks emerging between cities and progressive mayors and so on sharing ideas, and I think that's interesting and important as a almost an alternative framework of mobilization to that of the nation state, which remains to a much greater degree, I think, under the control of sort of oligarchs or fossil fuel interests and things of that kind.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and tech companies and yeah,
Yeah,
that's to me one of the scariest things that's taking place is just how integrated capital and governance has become to where it's almost like I mean here in the US it's almost like displaced. I don't know if you've heard at all, but there's this an ecological disaster from a train that got derailed carrying vinyl chloride, and they're getting nothing from no media coverage, government's doing nothing, transportation department's doing nothing, and it's all due to the train companies lobbying to not have to do safety upgrades. And it's on the heels of the Biden administration shutting down the rail workers were striking earlier this year. And so they shut that down. And then there's disaster after disaster happening now. And but this recent one is horrible. It's poisoned like a whole town.
right, right.
Yeah. And it's that integration of governance and money that just
Yes,
creates a stasis where there's just, oh, this is what you get.
yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a long history in North America, aren't there, of these poisoned communities, so-called the Cancer Alley in Louisiana and West Virginia as well, with very poor health quality.
Yeah, yeah. And cities that just aren't even able to provide like water. I think that was a recent
Yeah.
one too in Mississippi and also in Detroit or not Detroit, Flint.
Yeah,
But
that's right. The Flint case is very famous, and it's actually in my own discipline in geography that there have been some excellent articles discussing the specific case of Flint.
oh, really?
Yeah,
And I mean, I understand just a little bit, but I mean, they even like turn the flow of a river around. Like, I don't remember the details, but the extent that they went to implement like a different water system that then is a total failure.
yeah,
Um, yeah, so that covered it. So like thinking of the city still. Um, I guess there's this going from like a pre-modern or like an earlier township to more of like the major metropolitan areas that we have now. Is
mm,
that sort of an issue where an increase in scale sort of creates almost like a phase shift where it's like a qualitative shift too? Or is it, I mean, technology driven? I'm sure it's in all of it together.
mm.
Um,
I mean, I think one perspective is that the emergence of larger cities, industrial cities, in the 19th century generates a very specific set of social and environmental challenges, and responding to those actually is one of the drivers for what we understand to be the emergence of urban planning, environmental regulation, public health policy, and so on. So that um, this particular historical phase has generated a very important set of responses, which continue to influence the way we understand and try to manage urban space. But I think one of the interesting tensions is the classic model is of the so-called modern infrastructural ideal that the scholars Graham and Marvin talk about as a particular model for how cities should be run, but the sense that this has, as we just talked about, has become very fractured or splintered within the global north. But as in a way, it never really operated within the global south. It was always a very uneven landscape. And also within the global north, my colleague Katie Meehan at King's College in London has been looking at plumbing poverty, American cities like San Francisco and Portland, where thousands of families don't have access to drinkable water and things of that kind. So that when you actually look in some of the wealthiest areas or the wealthiest metropolitan areas, there are extreme inequalities in terms of access to basic infrastructure and other services.
I didn't know that. It's in San Francisco even.
It's one of the worst cities in America. Yeah.
And so it's just it's an issue of financial. It's just the cost of water is so high that they can't afford.
Yes, exactly. That there are households who cannot afford basic services in some of the richest metropolitan areas in North America. Exactly.
Yeah. And what was the name of your colleague who's doing that research?
Katie Meehan at King's College London.
Yeah, that's astounding. Just I didn't know, and so I'm surprised. I would love to see that discussed broader. I think there's like a silence about a lot of the major issues within media, and yeah, so it's good to know that it's being studied. But yeah, okay. So I wanted to jump over the glare of modernity and the introduction of lighting into the urban environment with the rise of modernity historically. And you spoke about it happening in tandem with the rise of policing, the modern day police force, and then also in tandem with the emergence of the liberal subject. And so I was curious about those two, particularly I guess in relation to how maybe historically that would have, its context in the historical emergence of modernity.
Yes, I mean we've spoken a bit about water and modernity and technological networks, and light is a different kind of entry point. Also, a set of technological networks, attempts to transform the management and experience of space in different ways. And I think that through looking at light, it really raises all kinds of interesting questions about modernity and urbanization. And there are different ways into this topic. I mean, one question clearly is the changing technologies of light through the early modern and modern cities, and the use of whale oil in lights, for example. And when you think about that the illumination is caused by the hunting of whales, which is a very brutal episode in global environmental history. And then we think about specific technologies like gas lighting with its very particular type of light that it emits. So I'm here in Berlin as we speak, and it has one of Europe's last still functional gas lighting networks in this part of former West Berlin, which gives off a very soft glow. It's a very distinctive light that urbanists like Walter Benjamin and others were really drawn to, and different from this extremely kind of bright LED type lighting that we're becoming increasingly familiar with, which is on the one hand described as being more ecological because it's cheaper, but actually because it's much brighter, and the spectrum it emits is very disturbing to people's sleep. It has ecological consequences as well. So lighting is a very complicated topic, and it's interesting to me that not many cities have a clearly worked out a policy about light, or even a conception of what they're trying to achieve. France is quite advanced. A number of French cities have quite sophisticated lighting plans, but in many metropolitan areas, there's not really any plan at all. And there's a lot of evidence about how not just cities, but the globe is becoming brighter with all kinds of different implications in terms of the absence of the night sky, the disruption to migratory birds and other organisms, the disruption of sleep I mentioned briefly. There's an excellent book by Jonathan Crary, 24/7, which is coming at this question about the kind of incessant activity, partly enabled through light and other technological networks. So that the notion of never resting, never sleeping, never really thinking becomes part of a wider critique of global capitalism, which is very interesting.
Yeah, yeah, I've that's what I was pretty fascinated by. And that point about the quality of light changing from, the gas lamps to the LED and just that more sterile feeling. It's horrible, really. I don't know if you're in a room that's just like it's like being in a fluorescent room or something. It's like your soul dies almost compared to something that just is more, I don't know, has a different character to it and a different richness. But then, yeah, the deeper that lighting just starts to permeate the fabric of society, and outdoor spaces, indoor spaces, glowing screens, devices that we constantly have, and then the power dynamics at play there. One of the things that was interesting in your article too was the incorporation of lighting in the factory as a way to prolong the working hours, and how that same dynamic can be carried forward, and the same, let's say, forces of business and money interests, there's that same political tension will exist, but now it's carried into our homes, and emails come at any hour, phone calls could be made at any time, and it eliminates the off time.
Yes, very much so. I think that the question of light is related to a culture of continuous distraction,
Hmm.
and that affects the way we think about things, the way we talk about things, and also we think about cities, if you like, the visual scenography of the city with flickering, moving screens and all of these things. I was with my students the other day. We were discussing Blade Runner, the original from Ridley
uh,
Scott from 1982, and the opening scene of Los Angeles in 2019, which has been and gone, but these giant moving screens and everything, and trying to conceptualize the future through technologies is very interesting, because sometimes these predictions seem to be incredibly prescient, and other times they seem to be kind of mistaken very fundamentally. But I think the notion of the moving image and the city itself becoming a kind of cinematic auditorium under digital capitalism was a very prescient observation, I think.
that's yeah, no, that's brilliant reference. That film in so many ways. The the other aspect of that too is just obliterating the heavens. So if we have this constant distraction and this very ephemeral environment that also has the effect of separating us from one of the main things that provides this sense of something greater that we have. We're on this ball hurling through vastness, and I remember the first time I went to New Zealand once, and the southern hemisphere, and also New Zealand is remote, and saw the sky there, and I mean, it was dimensional. You could see depth in the star. I mean, there's just so many stars, and I was spellbound. Like I could have just sat there and stared at that forever, and it just gives this sense of like that there is something much greater than these flashing images and going through our day to day. And there's something about that too, where it serves this power dynamic, severing that sense of the bigger in favor of the immediate and distracting. And
Yes, I mean, there have been these dark sky parks becoming quite popular, which is one attempt maybe to provide that reconnection. But what you're describing is for most people a rare experience if they ever have that opportunity.
yeah, I think I was 30, I think, when the first time I saw that. And yeah, I think about like and I grew up in Colorado. It's not like it's New York or Los Angeles or something where you just don't even there's like 3 stars that poke through. But what I saw there is completely I didn't even know it could be like that. And I don't know. I think if we did bring that into our life, it would be game changing in a lot of ways about what we value and where we place our attention. You know.
I mean, another parallel example maybe is in Washington State. I think it's the Olympic National Park, the
Mm.
1 square inch of silence project, where there's what is believed to be the quietest place in North America, and you're invited to just stay still and gradually become aware of all of the sounds around you. So it's part of a kind of multisensory awareness in a very interesting way.
Yeah, that's a what a great reference. I heard about that ages ago. I'm glad you mentioned it. Didn't they not even like reroute airlines and they went to some great lengths, I think, to ensure that if I'm remembering correctly.
I don't know the precise details if they were able to achieve that, but symbolically, this has been a very interesting project, I think.
Yeah, yeah. No, that is great. Yeah, because noise too. I mean, speaking of Berlin, I remember I was there for about a year, and I love the city. By the way, it's just so fascinating. But the sounds of the sirens are deafening, and I've even heard recently that there's somebody studying sort of like the decibel levels and how they've increased over time as a means of conveying the noise of cities, how it's increased over time because of what sort of like the baseline that the sirens have to penetrate. And yeah, to even just find quiet is a luxury. Yeah. But I just yeah, I found that article about light and that its role in sort of our world and how it's so unexamined by as you say by so many cities and governments and the need for a democratic say in how we use it. I really liked that approach. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think this is a key point you raise in terms of the possibility to choose different technological pathways. If it was possible that there could be a public debate or discussion about what kind of lighting people want, that people can be empowered to be involved in some way. There's a very interesting American philosopher, Andrew Feenberg, who writes about alternative modernities, which I found really influenced me in the sense that it's not inevitable that we should choose one technological system over another. And I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I've even with like economics and technological developments, um came across I think this was an idea that I heard after the 2008 crisis was even providing like a, means to um prototype new, let's say, economic, like they had done these mortgage backed securities. And if you had like a separate, almost like a computer driven or something, you can like run a model and test and see what sort of risks there are. And just before, having a considered way of doing something before it's introduced. Um, I think there'd be a lot of value in a lot of technologies doing that. A lot of new developments is having sort of like a prototyping stage or some, I don't know. I'm losing the term, but we just seem to release everything it's just so ad hoc and I don't know. So much of it's just driven by economics also.
Maybe returning to your point about plastics and also microplastics and so on, there are so many hundreds, if not thousands, of chemical compounds that are used and released into the environment that we don't have thorough toxicological studies of what these things actually do. And that is I think that's a very interesting, if you like, interface with citizen science as well, where the state fails or regulatory agencies are absent, how ordinary people can try to find out about things, maybe collaborate with sympathetic scientists and so on to actually build environmental knowledge in their communities, is a really important development.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you see that happening in places where people are starting to?
Yes, yes, sure. I mean, in terms of anti-fracking protests, I had some very interesting conversations in Denton, in Texas, where um, people are doing their own environmental monitoring because the state is absent. But they're doing it very carefully, like to the letter, in terms of the scientific analysis, in the hope that the data can actually carry some weight as a legal instrument, if they're able to actually challenge decision making. So this kind of citizen science approach is actually becoming, in some ways, increasingly sophisticated and linking with critical legal studies, and environmental organizations in general, I think, have to get much more sophisticated in terms of being able to make their case and actually achieve change, I think.
Yeah, so they're basically, are they testing water and doing that kind of, finding out what chemicals are in the water, what kind of damage is happening on that front? Is that mainly in air quality,
Things,
maybe?
yeah, things of that kind. I mean, I've referred to it as environmental mirroring, in the sense that they're following procedures very carefully so that the data can be legally robust,
Mhm.
if which is really important, because there are always experts for sale who will make a counter argument and be employed by corporations and others. So it's sometimes it's a battle between experts, or a battle between scientific paradigms. Similar things are going on actually in the northeast of England, in terms of uh, mass die-offs of crustaceans and other organisms in the sea, and rival explanations for what is the cause of this ecological collapse that's affecting the fishing industry. And there are rival groups of scientists with different sources of funding and so on, offering different explanations, and that's very illuminating.
Yeah, absolutely. That is, I could see that being critical, having the local residents, local population operating on their own, because yeah, the studies that for hire, it muddies the water so intensely. To have actual tangible data that's just us living here showing, what we're confronting. Um, yeah.
But it's also I think it's building communities, because I think that when people come together to collect data on things like that, also biodiversity monitoring as well, because the people coming together and carrying out science as a way of actually building communities through knowledge and participation, it's very interesting to me, because in some cases the local people or grassroots organizations are the experts, because the state is absent, or in relation to biodiversity, there are issues where museums have had their budgets cut so extensively for taxonomic research that that in order to collect data on changing distributions of organisms and things of that kind, the grassroots contribution is absolutely vital. In relation to ornithology and birds, there are millions of records collected by amateur ornithologists, effectively, which are collated together. For example, the Cornell Lab for Ornithology. And all of this data is so important in terms of monitoring global environmental change, because individual scientists, there aren't enough of them to collect all of the data that we need.
Yeah. And I mean, just there's so few, it seems like our societies have just become very fragmented as well. So to have anything where people are working together, that's huge. I mean, it's huge. It crosses probably left, right, up, down. It's a cause that people can rally around. I love that idea. You're involved in London as well, right? In studying biodiversity in the city?
Yes, sure. I've been working with other people to collect data, particularly on invertebrates, and also in relation to specific sites, and that's been very interesting to me. And I've learned a lot through that process. But you also encounter um, the limits to what the regulatory agencies are willing or able to do, because they've been cut back so significantly in an urban context. Environmental regulators are nervous to get involved in land use politics by, for example, designating sites as being ecologically vulnerable, because this can unsettle the planning process. So it's a constant process of negotiation.
Mhm.
Um, so it's a tricky time, and there's also, I mean, there's so much in Europe. There's a lot of data now about mass invertebrate decline, which is one of the topics that I'm particularly interested in. It's not just bees, but almost all classes of insects in mass decline, which is a signal of something that is fundamentally wrong with the health of ecosystems. And there are many, I mean, it's not just habitat destruction, but light pollution we discussed,
Yeah.
particular kinds of insecticides and so on. So there are multiple factors putting invertebrates and ecosystems more broadly under immense pressure.
God. What have you uncovered in that works some of these specific causes, or is it just the overlap of, 100 different things?
I mean, when you put all the data together and you look at it and you discuss it with colleagues, I mean, there are specific things that you can point to, as in the modification or destruction of habitats. The light pollution we talked about is very important for nocturnal ecology. All of these things together have clearly had an immense impact.
And so, like, the work that you've been doing with, I don't, I don't know what the right term is, but biodiversity in sort of untouched or not untouched, but undesigned sort of. Um, in German, is it the Brachen?
Yes, that's right. I mean, in terms of urban biodiversity, I've been particularly fascinated by these spontaneous spaces of nature, or wild urban nature, um, partly because they often have very unusual assemblages of ecological assemblages that are global in nature and are very interesting in that sense of cosmopolitan ecologies,
Mhm.
and also that they indicate relatively high levels of urban biodiversity as well. But they're also places of cultural fascination for artists, walkers, writers, and others. They have a very specific role within the context of urban nature, which I think is very, very valuable. And they're quite often in parts of cities which have the least access to conventional parks and so on. So they serve an important role as an alternative kind of public space, and a space of discovery, because they're not designed as such, which is probably why kids as well as artists are just really like these kind of spaces.
Yeah, I'm I love it myself personally. Um I've I really find it to be just like, also just, I don't know, um the overlay of history and how um they end up just happening in the first place. Like particularly in Berlin, you see it with, the collapse of two separate systems, and what that means to, if you have two radio stations, what happens to the old one, and just if you have a wall that now you remove, and then there's all this weird terrain that, how does that fit into the new whole? But also, the biodiversity and the richness of what you're describing, and how it creates sort of like a oddities and strange pockets. Does that help also to um, combat some of this loss? Like, do you find that some of the insect life or the invertebrates that are in peril are very find these spaces very useful too? that it's sort of like
That's
nature taking what it can.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, there's no doubt that some of these sites operate as kind of urban refugia or safe havens for biodiversity. And as the kind of agricultural hinterlands become more kind of monocultural deserts and so on, then these urban spaces become more significant. So maybe returning to our earlier point about cities being actually potential sites of positive ideas and new ways of thinking about nature. I think these recognizing these urban refugia is part of that process. And there are certain species of, for example, there's this a skylark, is a particular European bird, which is much diminished within sort of agricultural landscapes, but is settled on the site of former airfields and so on in urban areas in Berlin and other
Mhm.
cities, because you've got a similar kind of open space and so on. So it's you also have the kind of habitat mimicry in the way that birds of prey, falcons and hawks will nest on high buildings as if they're rock ledges and then adapt to this different ecology. So all of that I find really fascinating, and I think it really enriches public culture. Because on the question of biodiversity, I think that if people can't connect to biodiversity through ordinary environments, how will they be interested in these bigger global questions? I think biodiversity can't just be a remote interface, digital interface in a documentary or something. It's got to be something that's real and experienced, I think, to really involve people.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you so do you find Berlin to be particularly interesting in that regard?
Yes, I mean, I think Berlin is very interesting because it's had these very interesting spaces of nature. It's also had this very strong strand of urban ecology as an academic field developing in the city, which has been,
Oh.
great international influence. So that the city itself has a very kind of vibrant intellectual life surrounding the study and appreciation of these kind of marginal spaces. I mean, there are other cities like Montreal is an example,
Mhm.
Paris, where there's also and Brussels, where there's a lot of interest in these questions, but probably Berlin really stands out as a kind of focal point for the emergence of urban ecology and ecological ideas in recent years.
Mhm. There's something about the mentality of the culture in Berlin too that I could see being very um in line with that approach. And I don't know, like something like graffiti, like I noticed when I was there that there was one spot where they were building a new brick wall at, I think it was around a school, and they would do one section, let's say 20-foot section, go home for the night, come back the next morning completely tagged. And I think a lot of people, particularly maybe from the US, would look down on that as like, I don't know, something like how could you allow that, or like some, but knowing a small amount of the history of how you have you know not too long ago an entire system collapse. It's had a long history of political action, at the grassroots level. And graffiti is a way of just taking ownership. It's like you can put that wall up, but know that it's still our city. And I could see that also being a dynamic that would suit the encouragement of spaces to be left alone a little bit, and that not everything has to be designed top down, handed over. I don't know, but
Sure. I mean, I think there's been this emphasis on play and creativity in the city, and there are some new park designs like Park am Gleisteil, quite near to where I'm currently sitting,
mhm.
and there's a major graffiti wall is part of the park design. It's just an assumption as well as skating bowls and other features that people have thought quite carefully about what people want, and they've tried to link it all together, including interestingly ideas about urban ecology as well. So it's all in there in terms of this park design.
That's really cool. I had a professor when I was studying landscape architecture, and I don't know where or how where the data came from or what, but he made the thing that they had said that a lot of landscape architects when they were kids were exposed to spaces like that, and just undesigned sort of patches of wilderness or nature. And that was I mean, that was my case too. I was raised in this neighborhood, and there was, a stretch of woods that was just it was just untouched. The houses were around there. There were pastures left in the peripheral where horses were, and there's just a lot of places where you could go from home to like a somewhat, let's say, suburban street, and then right off of it you could go, and it was safe, you could go play. And as a kid particularly, just I mean, I remember the insects and just edges that had stuff growing over it. It wasn't just like a curb cut, and just loving it. I mean, um I don't know where I'm going with that, but so the idea that, like, I'm assuming a landscape architect was involved in the design of the park. It seems like it would be an easy idea to convince somebody to bring that into a planned space even.
Yes, I mean, interestingly, with that particular park design I mentioned, there's a continuity between former students of some of the urban ecologists in the city, then going on to work in architecture and landscape fields. So that there's a continuity of ideas used in the design. I think also from what you were just mentioning, there's no doubt that childhood experience is very important in terms of how we conceptualize nature and urban nature in particular, and on the specifics of the, if you like, the magic of the spontaneous spaces that you can't predict. There are some landscape designers, such as the French designer Gilles Clement, who's been a big influence on me, who from quite an early stage tried to bring in these spontaneous elements within his park design. So it was really fundamental from the start.
Yeah, that's great. I think and the more that you have these spaces in cities and kids have access to them, it it will carry forward in future generations being more open to it as well. It's still a fairly young profession, I think, and we're still, at least in the U.S., moving through some growing lessons, some learning lessons. Um, Also, in Tempelhof in Berlin, I found to be a really good, where there was so much pressure to develop it, and then ended up being, um, met local resistance, and now it's a park, and you can just rollerblade down the runways, and there's a lot of, uh, I think they've left a lot of space, right, to kind of blossom as is.
Yes, I mean it's still quite contentious, and there are immense pressures to build on parts of it because there is a housing crisis now in Berlin, and
Mhm.
rents are rising very rapidly. So it's proving increasingly difficult actually to protect some of these marginal spaces from development. So we're entering a different kind of historical moment compared with previous decades.
Yeah, yeah. That's gonna be, yeah. Those things are hard because the pressure doesn't ever stop, it seems. It's sort of like the, example in, was it Ecuador with the, you can win for a bit, and then at some point the pressure just it doesn't lay off, and so it has to be a sustained thing.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Um, One other thing, so I wanted to kind of like, and there was an upbeat note, I guess. I don't want to take too much more of your time, but in reading your, I do want to say that I loved Fabric of Space. I just read it this week, and I just found it to be very intriguing and thought provoking. And going through each of the different cities and using different examples of water to highlight a number of different issues that we're confronting. Um, but in relation to London in particular, which is the close of the book, you presented some more utopian ideas for like a future climate change society. and Squint Opera's work with visualizations that that show that you could imagine a different future, considering that all of these threats could happen, and so I found that to be I found it to be really interesting because I do think that there's sort of like a down on humanity view that can permeate a lot of this. Like we're a plague to the earth, and some of the like Matrix visions of being like parasites, and um, so I do find I like the idea of putting the challenge forward. You know, we can do better. Like humanity is pretty visionary and adaptive, and so I'm curious your thoughts on that. Like, given all of the what we've talked about with having to touch on, be a comprehensive approach and involves government and business and technology and economic instruments and structures, and just how we can pull all of that together in something that's positive. Do you have any
I mean,
thoughts?
I think sure. I mean, I think what I tried to touch on there is what I refer to as a counter dystopian narrative, and to work with some of these more experimental ideas, not because we're necessarily going to have these scenarios, but just to try to be imaginative. Because I think that if we're not imaginative about urban space and design and architecture, how are we going to build different kinds of cities and urban spaces? And London's interesting because in a way there's an unavoidable choice coming towards London and many other coastal cities. Are you going to build vast engineering defenses that dwarf the very sophisticated defenses already, or are you going to fundamentally rethink some kind of a natural floodplain or some completely different kind of relationship with the surrounding landscapes and coastal landscapes, and that choice is coming towards us, and I think if we don't have an imagination, I suspect we're going to be drawn towards these techno engineering options, partly because that's where all the money is as well, and that's a
Yeah.
whole other debate. But it'll be very interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, that was a really good example. I had no idea how precarious that London is, and the relationship with the Thames, and the tidal surges, and just the infrastructure that's there already, and how it's maybe got like another what 50 years maybe before it becomes, was it something like that, before it's just completely overrun?
I mean, it could be less. I mean, obviously there are so many unknowns that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean the future London faces a choice for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
And the use of the tidal space. Yeah, it was I really found that it was a good comparison of options and approaches, and I do find it it is interesting to see the shift culturally towards less hard engineered solutions, and working with natural spaces as to the extent that we can. But yeah, the pressure's there to put homes and buildings in some of that, and still, yeah, and then have to come in with even harder edges to it's just, yeah, it's a complex issue. But yeah, I did enjoy seeing sort of like the counter dystopian view, though. So hopefully it's a challenge that we hear and respond to. Yeah. Well, I just, yeah, I wanted to thank you for your time, and I really enjoyed talking with you, and I really enjoyed your work. I have Concrete and Clay, and then I was going to pick up Natura Urbana. Um, the film too. I'd be curious, 'cause that's based in Berlin, right? The film.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So I look forward to all of it. Yeah, and to see where you go from here. But
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I've enjoyed the conversation as well. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, and yeah, enjoy Berlin while you're there.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.